I did not feel at all seasick. But as the days passed, I became fidgety. I felt shy even in speaking to the steward. I was quite unaccustomed to talking English, and except for Sergeant Mazmudar, all the other passengers in the second saloon were English. I could not speak to them, for I could rarely follow their remarks when they came up to speak to me, and even when I understood, I could not reply. I had to frame every sentence in my mind before I could bring it out. I was innocent of the use of knives and forks, and had not the boldness to inquire what dishes on the menu were free of meat. I therefore never took meals at table, but always had them in my cabin, and they consisted principally of sweets and fruits which I had brought with me. Sergeant Mazmudar had no difficulty, and he mixed with everybody. He would move about freely on deck, while I hid myself in the cabin the whole day, only venturing up on deck when there were but few people. Sergeant Mazmudar kept pleading with me to associate with the passengers and to talk with them freely. He told me that the lawyers should have a long tongue, and related to me his legal experiences. He advised me to take every possible opportunity of talking English and not to mind making mistakes which were obviously unavoidable with a foreign tongue, but nothing could make me conquer my shyness. An English passenger, taking kindly to me, drew me into conversation. He was older than I. He asked me what I ate, what I was, where I was going, why I was shy, and so on. He also advised me to come to table. He laughed at my insistence on abjuring meat, and said in a friendly way when we were in the Red Sea, "It is all very well so far, but you will have to revise your decision in the Bay of Biscay. And it is so cold in England that one cannot possibly live there without meat." "But I have heard that people can live there without eating meat," I said. "Rest assured it is a fib," said he. "No one to my knowledge lives there without being a meat eater. Don't you see that I am not asking you to take liquor, though I do so? But I do think you should eat meat, for you cannot live without it. I thank you for your kind advice, but I have solemnly promised to my mother not to touch meat, and therefore I cannot think of taking it. If it be found impossible to get on without it, I will far rather go back to India than eat meat in order to remain there." We entered the Bay of Biscay, but I did not begin to feel the need either of meat or liquor. I had been advised to collect certificates of my having abstained from meat, and I asked the English friend to give me one. He gladly gave it, and I treasured it for some time. But when I saw later that one could get such a certificate in spite of being a meat eater, it lost all its charm for me. If my word was not to be trusted, where was the use of possessing a certificate in the matter? However, we reached Southampton, as far as I remember, on a Saturday. On the boat I had worn a black suit, the white flannel one, which my friends had got me, having been kept especially for wearing when I landed. I had thought that white clothes would suit me better when I stepped ashore, and therefore I did so in white flannels. Those were the last days of September, and I found I was the only person wearing such clothes. I left in charge of an agent of Grindlay & Co. all my kit, including the keys, seeing that many others had done the same, and I must follow suit. I had 4 notes of introduction: to Dr. P.J. Mehta, to Sergeant Dalpatram Shukla, to Prince Ranjit Singh Ji, and Dadabhai Nauroji. Someone on board had advised us to put up at the Victoria Hotel in London. Sergeant Mazmudar and I accordingly went there. The shame of being the only person in white clothes was already too much for me, and when at the hotel I was told that I should not get my things from Grindlay's the next day, it being a Sunday, I was exasperated. Dr. Mehta, to whom I had wired from Southampton, called at about 8 o'clock the same evening. He gave me a hearty greeting. He smiled at my being in flannels. As we were talking, I casually picked up his top hat, and trying to see how smooth it was, passed my hand over it the wrong way and disturbed the fur. Dr. Mehta looked somewhat angrily at what I was doing and stopped me. But the mischief had been done. The incident was a warning for the future. This was my first lesson in European etiquette, into the details of which Dr. Mehta humorously initiated me. "Do not touch other people's things," he said. "Do not ask questions as we usually do in India on first acquaintance. Do not talk loudly. Never address people as a sir whilst speaking to them as we do in India. Only servants and subordinates address their masters that way," and so on and so forth. He also told me that it was very expensive to live in a hotel and recommended that I should live with a private family. We deferred consideration of the matter until Monday. Sergeant Mazmudar and I found the hotel to be a trying affair. It was also very expensive. There was, however, a Sindhi fellow passenger from Malta who had become friends with Sergeant Mazmudar, and as he was not a stranger to London, he offered to find rooms for us. We agreed, and on Monday, as soon as we got our baggage, we paid up our bills and went to the rooms rented for us by the Sindhi friend. I remembered my hotel bill came to £3, an amount which shocked me, and I had practically starved in spite of this heavy bill, for I could relish nothing. When I did not like one thing, I asked for another, but had to pay for both just the same. The fact is that all this while I had depended on the provisions which I had brought with me from Bombay. I was very uneasy even in the new rooms. I would continually think of my home and country. My mother's love always haunted me. At night the tears would stream down my cheeks, and home memories of all sorts made sleep out of the question. It was impossible to share my misery with anyone, and even if I could have done so, where was the use? I knew of nothing that would soothe me. Everything was strange, the people, their ways, and even their dwellings. I was a complete novice in the matter of English etiquette, and continually had to be on my guard. There was the additional inconvenience of the vegetarian vow. Even the dishes that I could eat were tasteless and insipid. I thus found myself between Scylla and Charybdis. England I could not bear, but to return to India was not to be thought of. Now that I had come, I must finish the 3 years, said the inner voice. Dr. Mehta went on Monday to the Victoria Hotel, expecting to find me there. He discovered that we had left, got our new address, and met me at our rooms. Through sheer folly, I had managed to get ringworm on the boat. For washing and bathing, we used to have sea water, in which soap is not soluble. I, however, used soap, taking its use to be a sign of civilization, with the result that instead of cleaning the skin, it made it greasy. This gave me ringworm. I showed it to Dr. Mehta, who told me to apply acetic acid. I remember how the burning acid made me cry. Dr. Mehta inspected my room and its appointments and shook his head in disapproval. "This place won't do," he said. "We come to England not so much for the purpose of studies as for gaining experience of English life and customs. And for this you need to live with a family. But before you do so, I think you had better serve a period of apprenticeship with so-and-so. I will take you there." I gratefully accepted the suggestion and removed to the friend's rooms. He was all kindness and attention. He treated me as his own brother, initiated me into English ways and manners, and accustomed me to talking the language. My food, however, became a serious question. I could not relish boiled vegetables cooked without salt or condiments. The landlady was at a loss to know what to prepare for me. We had oatmeal porridge for breakfast, which was fairly filling, but I always starved at lunch and dinner. The friend continually reasoned with me to eat meat, but I always pleaded my vow and then remained silent. Both for luncheon and dinner we had spinach and bread and jam too. I was a good eater and had a capacious stomach. But I was ashamed to ask for more than 2 or 3 slices of bread, as it did not seem correct to do so. Added to this, there was no milk either for lunch or dinner. The friend once got disgusted with this state of things and said, "Had you been my own brother, I would have sent you packing. What is the value of a vow made before an illiterate mother and in ignorance of conditions here? It is no vow at all. It would not be regarded as a vow in law. It is pure superstition to stick to such a promise. And I tell you, this persistence will not help you to gain anything here. You confess to having eaten and relished meat. You took it where it was absolutely unnecessary and will not where it is quite essential. What a pity. But I was adamant. Day in and day out the friend would argue, but I had an eternal negative to face him with. The more he argued, the more uncompromising I became. Daily I would pray for God's protection and get it. Not that I had any idea of God. It was faith that was at work, faith of which the seed had been sown by the good nurse Rambha. One day the friend began to read to me Bentham's theory of utility. I was at my wit's end. The language was too difficult for me to understand. He began to expound it. I said, "Pray excuse me. These abstruse things are beyond me. I admit it is necessary to eat meat, but I cannot break my vow. I cannot argue about it. I am sure I cannot meet you in argument. But please give me up as foolish or obstinate. I appreciate your love for me, and I know you to be my well-wisher. I also know that you are telling me again and again about this because you feel for me. But I am helpless. A vow is a vow. It cannot be broken." The friend looked at me in surprise. He closed the book and said, "All right, I will not argue any more." I was glad. He never discussed the subject again, but he did not cease to worry about me. He smoked and drank, but he never asked me to do so. In fact, he asked me to remain away from both. His one anxiety was lest I should become very weak without meat and thus be unable to feel at home in England. That is how I served my apprenticeship for a month. The friend's house was in Richmond, and it was not possible to go to London more than once or twice a week. Dr. Mehta and Sergeant Dalpatram Shukla therefore decided that I should be put with some family. Sergeant Shukla hit upon an Anglo-Indian's house in West Kensington and placed me there. The landlady was a widow. I told her about my vow. The old lady promised to look after me properly, and I took up my residence in the house. Here too I practically had to starve. I had sent for sweets and other eatables from home, but nothing had yet come. Everything was insipid. Every day the old lady asked me whether I liked the food, but what could she do? I was still as shy as ever and dared not ask for more than was put before me. She had 2 daughters. They insisted on serving me with an extra slice or 2 of bread. But little did they know that nothing less than a loaf would have filled me. But I had found my feet now. I had not yet started upon my regular studies. I had just begun reading newspapers thanks to Sergeant Shukla. In India, I had never read a newspaper. But here I succeeded in cultivating a liking for them by regular reading. I always glanced over the Daily News, the Daily Telegraph and the Pall Mall Gazette. This took me hardly an hour. I therefore began to wander about. I launched out in search of a vegetarian restaurant. The landlady had told me that there were such places in the city. I would trot 10 or 12 miles each day, go into a cheap restaurant and eat my fill of bread, but would never be satisfied. During these wanderings, I once hit on a vegetarian restaurant in Farrington Street. The sight of it filled me with the same joy that a child feels on getting a thing after its own heart. Before I entered, I noticed a book for sale exhibited under a glass window near the door. I saw among them Salt's Plea for Vegetarianism. This I purchased for a shilling and went straight to the dining room. This was my first hearty meal since my arrival in England. God had come to my aid. I read Salt's book from cover to cover and was very much impressed by it. From the date of reading this book, I may claim to have become a vegetarian by choice. I blessed the day on which I had taken the vow before my mother. I had all along abstained from meat in the interests of truth and of the vow I had taken, but had wished at the same time that every Indian should be a meat eater, and had looked forward to being one myself freely and openly some day, and to enlisting others in the cause. The choice was now made in favor of vegetarianism, the spread of which henceforward became my mission. My faith in vegetarianism grew on me from day to day. Salt's book whetted my appetite for dietetic studies. I went in for all books available on vegetarianism and read them. One of these, Howard Williams' The Ethics of Diet, was a biographical history of the literature of human dietetics from the earliest period to the present day. It tried to make out that all philosophers and prophets from Pythagoras and Jesus down to those of the present age were vegetarians. Dr. Anna Kingsford's The Perfect Way in Diet was also an attractive book. Dr. Ellinson's writings on health and hygiene were likewise very helpful. He advocated a curative system based on regulation of the dietary of patients. Himself a vegetarian, he prescribed for his patients also a strictly vegetarian diet. The result of reading all this literature was that dietetic experiments came to take an important place in my life. Health was the principal consideration of these experiments to begin with, but later on, religion became the supreme motive. Meanwhile, my friend had not ceased to worry about me. His love for me led to him think that if I persisted in my objections to meat eating, I should not only develop a weak constitution, but should remain a duffer because I should never feel at home in English society. When he came to know that I had begun to interest myself in books on vegetarianism, he was afraid lest these studies should muddle my head, that I should fritter my life away in experiments, forgetting my own work and become a crank. He therefore made one last effort to reform me. He one day invited me to go to the theatre. Before the play, we were to dine together at the Holborn restaurant, to me a palatial place and the first big restaurant I had been to since leaving the Victoria Hotel. The stay at that hotel had scarcely been a helpful experience, for I had not lived there with my wits about me. The friend had planned to take me to this restaurant, evidently imagining that modesty would forbid any questions. And it was a very big company of diners, in the midst of which my friend and I sat sharing a table between us. The first course was a soup. I wondered what it might be made of, but dared not ask the friend about it. I therefore summoned the waiter. My friend saw the movement and sternly asked across the table what was the matter. With considerable hesitation, I told him that I wanted to inquire if the soup was a vegetable soup. "You are too clumsy for a decent society," he passionately exclaimed. "If you cannot behave yourself, you had better go. Feed in some other restaurant and await me outside." This delighted me. Out I went. There was a vegetarian restaurant close by, but it was closed. So I went without food that night. I accompanied my friend to the theatre, but he never said a word about the scene I had created. On my part, of course, there was nothing to say. That was the last friendly tussle we had. It did not affect our relations in the least. I could see and appreciate the love by which all my friend's efforts were actuated, and my respect for him was all the greater on account of our differences in thought and action. But I decided that I should put him at ease, that I should assure him that I would be clumsy no more, but try to become polished and make up for my vegetarianism by cultivating other accomplishments which fitted one for polite society. And for this purpose I undertook the all too impossible task of becoming an English gentleman. The clothes after the Bombay cut that I was wearing were, I thought, unsuitable for English society, and I got new ones at the Army and Navy stores. I also went in for a chimney pot hat costing 19 shillings, an excessive price in those days. Not content with this, I wasted £10 on an evening suit made in Bond Street, the centre of fashionable life in London, and got my good and noble-hearted brother to send me a double watch chain of gold. It was not correct to wear a ready-made tie, and I learnt the art of tying one for myself. While in India, the mirror had been a luxury permitted on the days when the family barber gave me a shave. Here I wasted 10 minutes every day before a huge mirror, watching myself arranging my tie and parting my hair in the correct fashion. My hair was by no means soft, and every day it meant a regular struggle with the brush to keep it in position. Each time the hat was put on and off, the hand would automatically move towards the head to adjust the hair, not to mention the other civilized habit of the hand every now and then operating for the same purpose when sitting in polished society. As if all this were not enough to make me look the thing, I directed my attention to other details that were supposed to go towards the making of an English gentleman. I was told it was necessary for me to take lessons in dancing, French and elocution. French was not only the language of neighboring France, but it was the lingua franca of the continent over which I had a desire to travel. I decided to take dancing lessons at a class and paid down £3 as a fee for a term. I must have taken about 6 lessons in 3 weeks, but it was beyond me to achieve anything like rhythmic motion. I could not follow the piano and hence found it impossible to keep time. What then was I to do? The recluse in the fable kept a cat to keep off the rats, and then a cow to feed the cat with milk, and a man to keep the cow, and so on. My ambitions also grew like the family of the recluse. I thought I should learn to play the violin in order to cultivate an ear for Western music. So I invested £3 in a violin and something more in fees. I sought a third teacher to give me lessons in elocution and paid him a preliminary fee of a guinea. He recommended Bell's Standard Elocutionist as the textbook, which I purchased, and I began with a speech of Pitt's. But Mr. Bell rang the bell of alarm in my ear and I awoke. I had not to spend a lifetime in England, I said to myself. What then was the use of learning elocution? And how could dancing make a gentleman of me? The violin I could learn even in India. I was a student and ought to go on with my studies. I should qualify myself to join the Inns of Court. If my character made a gentleman of me, so much the better. Otherwise, I should forego the ambition. These and similar thoughts possessed me, and I expressed them in a letter which I addressed to the elocution teacher, requesting him to excuse me from further lessons. I had taken only 2 or 3. I wrote a similar letter to the dancing teacher and went personally to the violin teacher with a request to dispose of the violin for any price it might fetch. She was rather friendly to me, so I told her how I had discovered that I was pursuing a false ideal. She encouraged me in the determination to make a complete change. This infatuation must have lasted about 3 months. The punctiliousness in dress persisted for years, but henceforward I became a student. Let no one imagine that my experiments in dancing and the like marked a stage of indulgence in my life. The reader will have noticed that even then I had my wits about me. That period of infatuation was not unrelieved by a certain amount of self-introspection on my part. I kept account of every farthing I spent, and my expenses were carefully calculated. Every little item, such as omnibus fares or postage or a couple of coppers spent on newspapers, would be entered and the balance struck every evening before going to bed. That habit has stayed with me ever since, and I know that as a result, though I have had to handle public funds amounting to lakhs, I have succeeded in exercising strict economy in their disbursement, and instead of outstanding debts have had invariably a surplus balance in respect of all the movements I have led. Let every youth take a leaf out of my book and make it a point to account for everything that comes into and goes out of his pocket, and like me, he is sure to be a gainer in the end. As I kept strict watch over my way of living, I could see that it was necessary to economize. I therefore decided to reduce my expenses by half. My accounts showed numerous items spent on fares. Again, my living with a family meant the payment of a regular weekly bill. It also included the courtesy of occasionally taking members of the family out to dinner and likewise attending parties with them. All this involved heavy items for conveyances, especially as, if the friend was a lady, custom required that the man should pay all the expenses. Also, dining out meant extra cost, as no deduction could be made from the regular weekly bill for meals not taken. It seemed to me that all these items could be saved, as likewise the drain on my purse caused through a false sense of propriety. So I decided to take rooms on my own account instead of living any longer in a family, and also to remove from place to place according to the work I had to do, thus gaining experience at the same time. The rooms were so selected as to enable me to reach the place of business on foot in half an hour and so save fares. Before this, I had always taken some kind of conveyance whenever I went anywhere and had to find extra time for walks. The new arrangement combined walks and economy, as it meant a saving of fares and gave me walks of 8 or 10 miles a day. It was mainly this habit of long walks that kept me practically free from illness throughout my stay in England and gave me a fairly strong body. Thus I rented a suite of rooms, one for a sitting room and another for a bedroom. This was the second stage. The third was yet to come. These changes saved me half the expense. But how was I to utilize the time? I knew that bar examinations did not require much study, and I therefore did not feel pressed for time. My weak English was a perpetual worry to me. Mr. afterwards Sir Frederick Lely's words, "Graduate first and then come to me," still rang in my ears. I should, I thought, not only be called to the bar, but have some literary degree as well. I inquired about the Oxford and Cambridge University courses, consulted a few friends, and found that if I elected to go to either of these places, that would mean greater expense and a much longer stay in England than I was prepared for. A friend suggested that if I really wanted to have the satisfaction of taking a difficult examination, I should pass the London matriculation. It meant a good deal of labor and much addition to my stock of general knowledge without any extra expense worth the name. I welcomed the suggestion, but the syllabus frightened me. Latin and a modern language were compulsory. How was I to manage Latin? But the friend entered a strong plea for it. Latin is very valuable to lawyers. Knowledge of Latin is very useful in understanding law books, and one paper in Roman law is entirely in Latin. Besides, a knowledge of Latin means greater command over the English language. It went home and I decided to learn Latin, no matter how difficult it might be. French I had already begun, so I thought that should be the modern language. I joined a private matriculation class. Examinations were held every 6 months and I had only 5 months at my disposal. It was an almost impossible task for me. But the aspirant, after being an English gentleman, chose to convert himself into a serious student. I framed my own timetable to the minute, but neither my intelligence nor memory promised to enable me to tackle Latin and French besides other subjects within the given period. The result was that I was ploughed in Latin. I was sorry but did not lose heart. I had acquired a taste for Latin. Also, I thought my French would be all the better for another trial, and I would select a new subject in the science group. Chemistry, which was my subject in science, had no attraction for want of experiments, whereas it ought to have been a deeply interesting study. It was one of the compulsory subjects in India, and so I had selected it for the London matriculation. This time, however, I chose heat and light instead of chemistry. It was said to be easy, and I found it to be so. With my preparation for another trial, I made an effort to simplify my life still further. I felt that my way of living did not yet befit the modest means of my family. The thought of my struggling brother, who nobly responded to my regular calls for monetary help, deeply pained me. I saw that most of those who were spending from 8 to 15 pounds monthly had the advantage of scholarships. I had before me examples of much simpler living. I came across a fair number of poor students living more humbly than I. One of them was staying in the slums in a room at 2 shillings a week and living on 2 pence worth of cocoa and bread per meal from Lockhart's cheap cocoa rooms. It was far from me to think of emulating him, but I felt I could surely have 1 room instead of 2 and cook some of my meals at home. That would be a saving of 4 to 5 pounds each month. I also came across books on simple living. I gave up the suite of rooms and rented one instead, invested in a stove, and began cooking my breakfast at home. The process scarcely took me more than 20 minutes, for there was only oatmeal porridge to cook and water to boil for cocoa. I had lunch out and for dinner bread and cocoa at home. This I managed to live on 1.03 a day. This was also a period of intensive study. Plain living saved me plenty of time, and I passed my examination. Let not the reader think that this living made my life by any means a dreary affair. On the contrary, the change harmonized my inward and outward life. It was also more in keeping with the means of my family. My life was certainly more truthful, and my soul knew no bounds of joy. As I searched myself deeper, the necessity for changes, both internal and external, began to grow on me. As soon as, or even before, I made alterations in my expenses and my way of living, I began to make changes in my diet. I saw that the writers on vegetarianism had examined the question very minutely, attacking it in its religious, scientific, practical, and medical aspects. Ethically, they had arrived at the conclusion that man's supremacy over the lower animals meant not that the former should prey upon the latter, but that the higher should protect the lower, and that there should be mutual aid between the two as between man and man. They had also brought out the truth that man eats not for enjoyment but to live, and some of them accordingly suggested and effected in their lives abstention not only from flesh meat but from eggs and milk. Scientifically, some had concluded that man's physical structure showed that he was not meant to be a cooking but a frugivorous animal, that he could take only his mother's milk and, as soon as he had teeth, should begin to take solid foods. Medically, they had suggested the rejection of all spices and condiments. According to the practical and economic argument, they had demonstrated that a vegetarian diet was the least expensive. All these considerations had their effect on me, and I came across vegetarians of all these types in vegetarian restaurants. There was a vegetarian society in England with a weekly journal of its own. I subscribed to the weekly, joined the society, and very shortly found myself on the executive committee. Here I came in contact with those who were regarded as pillars of vegetarianism and began my own experiments in dietetics. I stopped taking the sweets and condiments I had got from home. The mind having taken a different turn, the fondness for condiments wore away, and I now relished the boiled spinach, which in Richmond tasted insipid, cooked without condiments. Many such experiments taught me that the real seat of taste was not the tongue but the mind. The economic consideration was, of course, constantly before me. There was in those days a body of opinion which regarded tea and coffee as harmful and favored cocoa. And as I was convinced that one should eat only articles that sustained the body, I gave up tea and coffee as a rule and substituted cocoa. There were two divisions in the restaurants I used to visit. One division, which was patronized by fairly well-to-do people, provided any number of courses from which one chose and paid for a la carte, each dinner thus costing from 1 to 2 shillings. The other division provided 6-penny dinners of 3 courses with a slice of bread. In my days of strict frugality, I usually dined in the second division. There were many minor experiments going on along with the main one, as for example, giving up starchy foods at one time, living on bread and fruit alone at another, and once living on cheese, milk and eggs. This last experiment is worth noting. It lasted not even a fortnight. The reformer who advocated starchless food had spoken highly of eggs and held that eggs were not meat. It was apparent that there was no injury done to living creatures in taking eggs. I was taken in by this plea and took eggs in spite of my vow. But the lapse was momentary. I had no business to put a new interpretation on the vow. The interpretation of my mother, who administered the vow, was there for me. I knew that her definition of meat included eggs, and as soon as I saw the true import of the vow, I gave up eggs and the experiment alike. There is a nice point underlying the argument and worth noting. I came across three definitions of meat in England. According to the first, meat denoted only the flesh of birds and beasts. Vegetarians who accepted that definition abjured the flesh of birds and beasts but ate fish, not to mention eggs. According to the second definition, meat meant flesh of all living creatures. So fish was here out of the question, but eggs were allowed. The third definition included under meat the flesh of living beings as well as all their products, thus covering eggs and milk alike. If I accepted the first definition, I could take not only eggs but fish also. But I was convinced that my mother's definition was the definition binding on me. If therefore I would observe the vow I had taken, I must abjure eggs. I therefore did so. This was a hardship inasmuch as inquiry showed that even in vegetarian restaurants, many courses used to contain eggs. This meant that unless I knew what was what, I had to go through the awkward process of ascertaining whether a particular course contained eggs or no, for many puddings and cakes were not free from them. But though the revelation of my duty caused this difficulty, it simplified my food. The simplification in its turn brought me annoyance in that I had to give up several dishes I had come to relish. These difficulties were only passing, for the strict observance of the vow produced an inward relish distinctly more healthy, delicate and permanent. The real ordeal, however, was still to come, and that was in respect of the other vow. But who dare harm whom God protects? A few observations about the interpretation of vows or pledges may not be out of place here. Interpretation of pledges has been a fruitful source of strife all the world over. No matter how explicit the pledge, people will turn and twist the text to suit their own purposes. They are to be met with among all classes of society, from the rich down to the poor, from the prince down to the peasant. Selfishness turns them blind, and by a use of the ambiguous middle, they deceive themselves and seek to deceive the world and God. One golden rule is to accept the interpretation honestly put on the pledge by the party administering it. Another is to accept the interpretation of the weaker party where there are two interpretations possible. Rejection of these two rules gives rise to strife and iniquity, which are rooted in untruthfulness. He who seeks truth alone easily follows the golden rule. He need not seek learned advice for interpretation. My mother's interpretation of meat was, according to the golden rule, the only true one for me, and not the one my wider experience or my pride of better knowledge might have taught me. My experiments in England were conducted from the point of view of economy and hygiene. The religious aspect of the question was not considered until I went to South Africa, where I undertook strenuous experiments which will be narrated later. The seed, however, for all of them was sown in England. A convert's enthusiasm for his new religion is greater than that of a person who is born in it. Vegetarianism was then a new cult in England, and likewise for me, because, as we have seen, I had gone there a convinced meat eater, and was intellectually converted to vegetarianism later. Full of the neophyte's zeal for vegetarianism, I decided to start a vegetarian club in my locality, Bayswater. I invited Sir Edwin Arnold, who lived there, to be vice president. Dr. Oldfield, who was the editor of the Vegetarian, became president. I myself became the secretary. The club went well for a while, but came to an end in the course of a few months. For I left the locality according to my custom of moving from place to place periodically. But this brief and modest experience gave me some little training in organizing and conducting institutions. I was elected to the executive committee of the Vegetarian Society and made it a point to attend every one of its meetings, but I always felt tongue-tied. Dr. Oldfield once said to me, "You talk to me quite all right, but why is it that you never open your lips at a committee meeting? You are a drone." I appreciated the banter. The bees are ever busy, the drone is a thorough idler, and it was not a little curious that whilst others expressed their opinions at these meetings, I sat quite silent. Not that I never felt tempted to speak, but I was at a loss to know how to express myself. All the rest of the members appeared to me to be better informed than I. Then it often happened that just when I had mustered up courage to speak, a fresh subject would be started. This went on for a long time. Meantime, a serious question came up for discussion. I thought it wrong to be absent and felt it cowardice to register a silent vote. The discussion arose somewhat in this wise. The president of the society was Mr. Hills, proprietor of the Thames Iron Works. He was a Puritan. It may be said that the existence of the society depended practically on his financial assistance. Many members of the committee were more or less his proteges. Dr. Ellinson of vegetarian fame was also a member of the committee. He was an advocate of the then new birth control movement and preached its methods among the working classes. Mr. Hills regarded these methods as cutting at the root of morals. He thought that the vegetarian society had for its object not only dietetic but also moral reform, and that a man of Dr. Ellinson's anti-Puritanic views should not be allowed to remain in the society. A motion was therefore brought for his removal. The question deeply interested me. I considered Dr. Ellinson's views regarding artificial methods of birth control as dangerous, and I believed that Mr. Hills was entitled as a Puritan to oppose him. I had a high regard for Mr. Hills and his generosity, but I thought it was quite improper to exclude a man from a vegetarian society simply because he refused to regard Puritan morals as one of the objects of the society. Mr. Hill's view regarding the exclusion of anti-Puritans from the society was personal to himself, and it had nothing to do with the declared object of the society, which was simply the promotion of vegetarianism and not of any system of morality. I therefore held that any vegetarian could be a member of the society irrespective of his views on other morals. There were in the committee others also who shared my view, but I felt myself personally called upon to express my own. How to do it was the question. I had not the courage to speak, and I therefore decided to set down my thoughts in writing. I went to the meeting with the document in my pocket. So far as I recollect, I did not find myself equal even to reading it, and the president had it read by someone else. Dr. Ellinson lost the day. Thus, in the very first battle of the kind, I found myself siding with the losing party. But I had comfort in the thought that the cause was right. I have a faint recollection that, after this incident, I resigned from the committee. This shyness I retained throughout my stay in England. Even when I paid a social call, the presence of half a dozen or more people would strike me dumb. I once went to Ventnor with Sergeant Mazmudar. We stayed there with a vegetarian family. Mr. Howard, the author of the Ethics of Diet, was also staying at the same watering place. We met him and he invited us to speak at the meeting for the promotion of vegetarianism. I had ascertained that it was not considered incorrect to read one's speech. I knew that many did so to express themselves coherently and briefly. To speak extempore would have been out of the question for me. I had therefore written down my speech. I stood up to read it but could not. My vision became blurred and I trembled, though the speech hardly covered a sheet of foolscape. Sergeant Mazmudar had to read it for me. His own speech was of course excellent and was received with applause. I was ashamed of myself and sad at heart for my incapacity. My last effort to make a public speech in England was on the eve of my departure for home. But this time too I only succeeded in making myself ridiculous. I invited my vegetarian friends to dinner in the Holborn restaurant referred to in these chapters. A vegetarian dinner could be had, I said to myself, in vegetarian restaurants as a matter of course. But why should it not be possible in a non-vegetarian restaurant too? And I arranged with the manager of the Holborn restaurant to provide a strictly vegetarian meal. The vegetarians hailed the new experiment with delight. All dinners are meant for enjoyment, but the West has developed the thing into an art. They are celebrated with great eclat, music and speeches. And the little dinner party that I gave was also not unaccompanied by some such display. Speeches therefore there had to be. When my turn for speaking came, I stood up to make a speech. I had with great care thought out one which would consist of a very few sentences, but I could not proceed beyond the first sentence. I had read of Edison that he began his maiden speech in the House of Commons, repeating, "I conceive," 3 times, and when he could proceed no further, a wag stood up and said, "The gentleman conceived thrice but brought forth nothing." I had thought of making a humorous speech, taking this anecdote as the text. I therefore began with it and stuck there. My memory entirely failed me, and in attempting a humorous speech, I made myself ridiculous. "I thank you, gentlemen, for having kindly responded to my invitation," I said abruptly and sat down. It was only in South Africa that I got over this shyness, though I never completely overcame it. It was impossible for me to speak impromptu. I hesitated whenever I had to face strange audiences and avoided making a speech whenever I could. Even today I do not think I could or would even be inclined to keep a meeting of friends engaged in idle talk. I must say that, beyond occasionally exposing me to laughter, my constitutional shyness has been no disadvantage whatever. In fact, I can see that, on the contrary, it has been all to my advantage. My hesitancy in speech, which was once an annoyance, is now a pleasure. Its greatest benefit has been that it has taught me the economy of words. I have naturally formed the habit of restraining my thoughts, and I can now give myself the certificate that a thoughtless word hardly ever escapes my tongue or pen. I do not recollect ever having had to regret anything in my speech or writing. I have thus been spared many a mishap and waste of time. Experience has taught me that silence is part of the spiritual discipline of a votary of truth. Proneness to exaggerate, to suppress or modify the truth, wittingly or unwittingly, is a natural weakness of man, and silence is necessary in order to surmount it. A man of a few words will rarely be thoughtless in his speech. He will measure every word. We find so many people impatient to talk. There is no chairman of a meeting who is not pestered with notes for permission to speak. And whenever the permission is given, the speaker generally exceeds the time limit, asks for more time, and keeps on talking without permission. All this talking can hardly be said to be of any benefit to the world. It is so much waste of time. My shyness has been in reality my shield and buckler. It has allowed me to grow. It has helped me in my discernment of truth.